Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a truly fascinating cultural intersection, ancient Eastern Sri Lankan Muslim wedding traditions. What makes this heritage so captivating is how they took ancient, local customs and seamlessly adapted them to fit perfectly inside a very strict religious framework. It's honestly a masterclass in cultural preservation. So we're going to explore the entire life cycle of traditions that define families in this region for generations.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is the chronological roadmap we'll be taking. First up, the Islamic foundations. Second, matchmaking. Third, the engagement tray. Fourth, setting the date. Fifth, the henna rituals. And finally, we'll wrap up with post-wedding traditions.
Starting off with Section 1, Islamic foundations, the absolute bedrock of tradition.
Now, even though the regional culture was heavily influenced by Tamil neighbors and the local geography, these marriages were structured around a rigid, unchanging core. These are the non-negotiable pillars. According to Islamic law, a marriage absolutely requires the wali, that's the bride's guardian. It also strictly requires the mahar, a mandatory marital gift or dowry, given directly from the groom to the bride. Then there's the ijab kabul, the official verbal contract of marriage, which has to be witnessed by at least two credible people. And covering all of this is the strict umbrella of modesty. These foundational rules were the absolute boundaries. Literally everything else we're about to talk about was carefully designed to never contradict these core religious requirements. Moving on to Section 2. Matchmaking, the quiet negotiations. You know, in ancient Eastern Sri Lanka, marriage was never just about two individuals falling in love. It was a highly strategic family alliance. The crucial point here is Santam Pesuthal, which was the traditional matchmaking process. Families meticulously evaluated potential matches through trusted family friends and community networks. They weren't looking for a quick spark of romance. They were analyzing property holdings, family influence, educational background, religious devotion, and the bride's character. The groom's family would make the initial inquiries, and the bride's family would actually take a few days to deliberate before giving any kind of response. It was this calculated, delicate dance of reputation and compatibility. And here's a really interesting detail. They often looked very close to home. There was a strong historical preference for marrying cousins, specifically maternal or paternal cross-cousins. In the local dialect, they actually had a saying that essentially translates to tying what grew in the straw with the straw. This was a highly localized, deliberate economic strategy. By keeping marriages within the extended family, they ensured that valuable ancestral wealth, agricultural lands, and cattle herds remained completely intact and undivided within the family line. Which brings us to Section 3, the engagement tray, also known as Vetta Kandu Pogatel. So once a match was actually agreed upon, it was time for the official engagement announcement, known as Thitakatuthul, and this was led predominantly by the bride's male relatives. But they definitely didn't arrive empty-handed, and this brilliantly illustrates the incredible attention to their culture. They brought a gleaming, beautifully polished bronze tray called the vata. Preparing this tray was literally an art form. Elders would sit on mats and assemble it step by step. They'd select flawless, wide water beetle leaves and arrange them carefully so the faces pointed outward. Then, they layered it with spices, cardamom, cloves, nutmeg, and dried fruits. Finally, the whole tray, just overflowing with sensory delights, was tightly bound up in a white cloth. Now, you might be wondering about the specific numbers involved. The ancient Eastern Sri Lankan Muslim culture had an intense obsession with odd numbers. Whether they were packing that bronze bhakta with beetle leaves and spices, or bringing woven brass boxes filled with traditional sweets like oil cakes, everything had to be in exact counts of 7, 9, 11, 21, or even 101. Following this odd number rule wasn't just a suggestion, it was an absolute requirement, driven by a strict belief that failing to do so would bring bad fortune. More specifically, they believed that breaking this rule meant the couple would end up divorced. Meanwhile, the women were running their own covert operations. During those early negotiation phases, the groom's female relatives would visit the bride's home for what was essentially a secret bridal inspection. While they were chatting and exchanging pleasantries, they were discreetly, but very sharply assessing everything. They judged the cleanliness of the household, the state of the kitchen, the bride's physical demeanor, and crucially, her hospitality. If the bride's family passed this secret test, the engagement would proceed. Just goes to show that the stress of impressing your future in-laws is a truly timeless tradition. All right, Section 4, setting the nuptial date. So the engagement is set, the properties are discussed, but picking the actual wedding day? You couldn't just choose a convenient weekend. Time itself was governed by celestial movements, and the selection process was incredibly rigid. Favorable days were restricted to Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. On top of that, the wedding strictly had to take place during a waxing moon, so as the moon grew fuller, and it had to fall on an odd-numbered date of the lunar calendar. On the flip side, Saturdays and Tuesdays were strictly avoided. The fear of bad luck completely overshadowed any logistical convenience. It's a perfect example of how regional astrological beliefs seamlessly integrated with the Islamic lunar calendar.
Now, what's really interesting here is this translated quote from an ancient folk song. It perfectly captures the true emotional reality of these arrangements. While we talk about all these beautiful traditions, there was a very heavy financial burden involved. Families would ask for vast plots of land, stone walls, and dozens of coconut trees. Folk songs from the era often feature the desperate voices of mothers, lamenting that they literally have no money to marry off their daughters. It reminds us that underneath the vibrant celebrations, social status and wealth heavily dictated who got married. Let's move into Section 5, Henna and Wedding Rituals. If you manage to navigate all the financial and astrological hurdles, those quiet negotiations finally exploded into a massive, vibrant community celebration. Early in the morning, or sometimes the day before the wedding, the groom's sisters would arrive at the bride's house carrying freshly ground henna leaves. And believe me, it was not a quiet arrival. They came in a huge procession, accompanied by the rhythmic, thumping beats of traditional parai drums, the loud cracks of fireworks, and the high-pitched, joyful ululations of the women. The bride's family would actually walk out to the middle of the street to meet them in this playful, loud standoff before everyone celebrated together. When we look at the aesthetic of the actual ancient wedding space, it was incredibly unique to this specific region. Instead of modern couches or chairs, the bride and groom were seated on something called a sevorokal. These were heavy, traditional brass mortar-like seats. It gave the wedding an incredibly grounded, majestic, ancient atmosphere, rooting the newly formed union quite literally in the foundational tools of domestic life. And while seated on those brass seats, the couple's appearance was governed by strict cultural and religious rules. The bride wore authentic Korai garments and beautifully draped traditional saris, heavily accessorized with gold jewelry. However, this is exactly where the strict Islamic boundaries completely overrode regional Tamil influences. Eastern Sri Lankan Muslim women strictly did not wear a potu. That's the colored mark on the forehead common in neighboring cultures. The potu was absolutely absent under all circumstances. Modesty and religious adherence were visually maintained, ensuring their distinct identity remained untouched. Let's move to Section 6 and see how this builds into essential post-wedding traditions.
Because honestly, signing the contract was merely the beginning. The community had a full post-wedding support system designed to help the couple transition into their new life. First, there was Apodu Puliodo Mutpath Harandu, where essential provisions like tamarind and basic food supplies were ceremonially brought to the newlyweds. Then came Kalmari Selatol, which was a ritualized first visit to the groom's house by the bride, cementing her place in his family's physical space. And finally, Arumatha Soru, a grand community feast hosted exactly 6 months after the wedding. These steps made sure that the extended family remained actively involved in the success of the marriage for months to come.
From the non-negotiable Islamic pillars to the rhythmic beating of the parai drums and the strict avoidance of the potu, this explainer highlights a community that completely mastered the art of adaptation without compromise. They took the agricultural, sensory, and communal beauty of the Eastern province and wove it into a strictly Islamic framework. So it leaves us to wonder, as modern life accelerates at an unbelievable pace, how do the echoes of these meticulously preserved ancient traditions continue to shape the vibrant identity of Eastern Sri Lankan Muslims today?